Ocean City, Maryland has 30,000 housing units and fewer than 7,000 year-round residents. Think about that ratio for a moment. 4 empty bedrooms for every occupied one. In January, entire towers along the Gold Coast go dark. Floor after floor of blank windows staring east at an ocean that nobody is watching. The town measures its summer population by monitoring the volume of sewage flowing through its treatment plant, a method called demo flush, because there is simply no other way to count the people. When the toilets are flushing hardest in late July, the number hits somewhere north of 300,000. By February, it falls back below 8,000. An entire city that appears and disappears with the season, like a sand castle. And sand, as it turns out, is the only thing Ocean City has ever really been about. The strip of Barrier Island where the town sits was, for most of human history, not a town at all. The Assateague people fished these waters long before any Englishmen arrived. The land was granted to Thomas Fenwick by Lord Baltimore in 1686, and for nearly 2 centuries afterward, almost nobody bothered with it. It was a wind-swept spit of sand between the Atlantic and Sinnapuxent Bay, beautiful, exposed, and profoundly inconvenient to reach. Stagecoach and ferry were the only options. You had to want to come here. In 1869, a man named Isaac Coffin built the first cottage to take paying guests. It was modest, little more than a roof over some beds near the surf, but it proved a concept. People from Baltimore and Philadelphia would, in fact, travel all that way to sleep next to the ocean. Within a few years, speculators had surveyed the beach and carved it into 250 lots. A corporation sold 4,000 shares of stock at $25 each. It was the oldest American trick. Find an empty stretch of ground, draw lines on it, and sell the lines. On July 4th, 1875, the Atlantic Hotel opened. 4 stories of wood, 400 rooms, columned porches wrapping around 3 sides to catch every breeze off the water. It was called a marvel of architectural beauty, the equal of any hotel on the eastern seaboard. Whether that was true is debatable, but the ambition was real. The building was so tall and so close to the beach that a team of horses could reportedly be driven beneath its porches. For 10 cents, you could dance in the ballroom under a crystal chandelier. The boardwalk, in those earliest years, was not permanent. Hotel owners would lay wooden sections in the sand each morning and pull them up again at night when the tide came in. Everything was temporary. Everything depended on the weather. What made Ocean City unusual, even then, was who ran it. The fishermen's wives and widows. While their husbands pulled pound boats through the surf, these women rented out spare bedrooms in summer, rolling their own children into a single room so paying guests could sleep in the others. They kept the books, managed the properties, and when the businesses grew, they built hotels. Locals would later call them the Petticoat Regime, and the name stuck because it was accurate. The most remarkable of them was Rosalie Tillman Shreve. She came from a plantation family near Oxford, Maryland, old Tidewater aristocracy, Tillmans who had served under George Washington. The Civil War ended that world. The plantation, Plimhimmon, lost its labor force and then its solvency. Rosalie married a Confederate veteran named Thomas Jefferson Shreve, who had contracted tuberculosis at Fort Delaware. He died 2 years later. She was 19, widowed, with 2 sons. She ran a boarding house in Baltimore during the winters and a cottage in Ocean City during the summers. Then, in 1894, she did something bold. She bought 2 oceanfront lots at 2nd Street and built a 48-room hotel with electricity powered by its own steam engine and a modern bathroom on every floor, luxuries that most homes in Baltimore didn't have. She named it after the lost plantation, the Plimhimmon. She sold the engine's surplus power to neighboring buildings because she was, in addition to everything else, the kind of person who couldn't stand waste. That hotel, rebuilt and renamed the Plim Plaza, still stands on the boardwalk between 1st and 2nd Streets. Its cupola, a replica added in 1963, remains the most recognizable silhouette in old downtown. At the Plimhimmon, rooms went for $2.50 a day. For that, you got a copious breakfast, a three-course midday meal, and a light supper that included on a typical evening broiled spring chicken, corn fritters, butterfish, cold ham, oysters poulette, hominy grits, peas, potatoes, grilled apples, rolls, corn pone cake, and peaches. $2.50. The world that number represents, the cost of labor, the availability of ingredients, the expectations of guests who dressed formally for dinner and rode wicker carriages along the boardwalk for 50 cents, has been extinct for a century. But the Plimhimmon's cupola is still there, watching. In 1892, the Sinnapuxent Beach Company of Baltimore purchased the Atlantic Hotel and 1,600 acres of nearby land, hoping to create farms that would supply the hotel with fresh local food. It was a vertically integrated resort operation decades before that phrase existed. Guests at the Atlantic and the Plimhimmon dressed for dinner, men in jackets, women in full-length gowns, and rode wicker carriages along the boardwalk while the sun set over the bay behind them. The early Ocean City was not democratic. It was genteel, deliberately so, marketed as the ladies' resort to the ocean. Bathing hours were regulated. The beach was unguarded. The expectation was propriety, and the prices were set accordingly. The town grew. The railroad arrived in 1878, connecting Ocean City to Salisbury, and from there to Baltimore and Philadelphia. Tourists made the long journey across the Chesapeake Bay by ferry to Claiborne, then took the train east. It was exhausting, but the beach was pristine, and by the turn of the century, a permanent boardwalk had been built high enough for the tides to wash under it. A pier extended over the surf, with a silent movie theater, bowling alleys, a roller skating rink, and a dance hall. Marksmen came from across the region for week-long trap shooting competitions, firing clay pigeons out over the Atlantic. The spent shells sank and vanished, which is what everything at Ocean City eventually does. On a freezing morning in December 1925, a fire broke out at the ESG Electric Company on Somerset Street and Baltimore Avenue. The wind was from the northwest, driving the flames toward the ocean. Everything went wrong. The fire engines broke down. Temperatures were so low that firefighters had to cut holes in the ice on the bay just to pump water. By the end of the day, the smoke was visible 10 miles away. 3 blocks of old downtown were gone. The Atlantic Hotel, the Seaside Hotel, 2 blocks of boardwalk, Doll's Candyland, the Casino Theater, and the C.W. Purnell Cottage. The town's entire center had been erased. The Atlantic Hotel was rebuilt by 1926. It still stands today, still operated by the Purnell family, who bought it in 1923. But the fire had revealed something essential about Ocean City. It was made of wood, and wood burns. The new building codes would change the material, but not the vulnerability. Ocean City would always be a place where destruction and rebuilding were not exceptions, but the fundamental rhythm of existence. Fire, storm, rebuild. Fire, storm, rebuild. Each time, something different came back. And then, the storm that changed everything. On August 22, 1933, after 4 straight days of rain, accounts say 10 inches per day, which is staggering even by hurricane standards, a Category 2 hurricane barreled into Ocean City. The wind and water did what wind and water do to a barrier island. But this storm did something more. It tore a hole through the southern end of town, ripping a channel from the bay to the ocean that had never existed before. Assateague Island and Ocean City, which had been a single continuous strip of sand for as long as anyone could remember, were now 2 separate places. The inlet was born. The bay water rushed through the breach with a force that survivors found terrifying, even in retrospect. There is film footage of it, preserved by the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and watching it, you can see the current tearing across the sand, as if the ocean itself had made a decision. Several blocks of homes and businesses south of 2nd Street were simply gone. Fishing camps were obliterated. The railroad bridge that had brought tourists into town for 55 years was washed away. Here is the part that no one anticipated. In the natural course of things, the inlet would have silted up within a few years, the way barrier island breaches always do. But the state of Maryland and the federal government spent over $780,000, Depression-era dollars when a house cost $3,000, to build jetties on both sides of the inlet and keep it permanently open. They stabilized the very wound the hurricane had inflicted, because they realized the wound was worth more than the intact island had ever been. With an inlet came access to the open Atlantic for fishing boats. Before 1933, Ocean City's commercial fishing operation was modest, men launching rowboats from the beach using net traps. After the inlet, charter boats could run directly into deep water. Captain Frank Parsons was the first to take a charter through the new passage, and in 1934, Paul and Jack Townsend discovered a stretch of offshore water so thick with white marlin that it would become known simply as the Jack Spot. By 1936, the Ocean City Marlin Club was recording 175 offshore white marlin. By 1939, that figure had soared to 1,343, and on a single legendary day, July 29, 1939, 171 white marlin were landed. Ocean City declared itself the white marlin capital of the world, and the name stuck because the fishing was that good. The sport fishing industry that grew up around the inlet transformed Ocean City's economy in ways the old boarding house owners could never have imagined. Piers and marinas sprouted along the bayside. Charter captains became local celebrities. In 1939, President Franklin Roosevelt himself came to fish white marlin out of the new inlet, and his visit cemented the town's reputation. The fishermen who had once rowed pound boats through the surf were now captaining diesel-powered charter boats carrying paying clients to the canyon edges of the continental shelf, 60 or 70 miles offshore, where the warm Gulf Stream water brought billfish within reach of Ocean City rods. That same inlet, the one the hurricane created and the government preserved, also destroyed the old railroad access. But by now the automobile was ascendant. The state built a vehicular bridge over Isle of Wight Bay on Route 50, and suddenly Ocean City was reachable by car. The hurricane had, in a single violent act, killed the railroad town and birthed the road trip destination. In the late 1930s and through the 1940s, young people poured in for the Pier Ballroom, where the big bands played: Glenn Miller, Jimmy Dorsey, Benny Goodman. For a dime, you could dance to the best music in America, with your feet practically over the ocean. The war years brought a quieter energy, but the post-war boom brought something else entirely: the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. When the bridge opened in 1952, it cut the travel time from Baltimore and Washington to the eastern shore by hours. Ocean City was suddenly a 3-hour drive from two major metropolitan areas. The effect was almost instantaneous. Motels sprouted along the Strip. Families who had never considered a beach vacation could now pack the car on Friday afternoon and be standing in the surf by dinner. In 1964, the completion of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel opened a corridor to the south, connecting the Delmarva Peninsula to southeastern Virginia. Ocean City was no longer an isolated resort for those willing to endure a difficult journey. It was the nearest beach for millions. Then came the Ash Wednesday storm. On the evening of March 5, 1962, Ocean City's roughly 1,500 year-round residents took shelter from what they assumed was a typical nor'easter. Nor'easters blow through in a day or so. This one did not. The storm parked itself off the coast for 36 hours, sending 5 consecutive high tides into the island. By Ash Wednesday, March 7th, the high tide was nearly 9.5 feet above the average low, surpassing even the 1933 hurricane, which had peaked at just over 7 feet. Winds hit 60 miles per hour. Waves reached 25 feet. The protective dunes were gone after the first tide. By the third, the ocean was running through town. A University of Maryland senior named Janet Holland was watching the CBS Evening News when Walter Cronkite reported that Ocean City was washing away. She called home immediately. Her mother, Mary Bell, told her what she could see from the window. Baltimore Avenue had become a river, and pieces of the boardwalk were floating past. Governor Millard Tawes surveyed the damage by helicopter. "This is the worst disaster in the history of Maryland in my time," he said. Sand blanketed the town so thickly that cars disappeared entirely. You could walk over a buried automobile without knowing it was there. Bulldozers worked for days to clear the streets. Inland, 1.2 million chickens and eggs were lost across the eastern shore. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, then 2 years into construction, had much of its partially completed work undone by the same storm. The total damage along the Atlantic coast from North Carolina to New England reached $200 million, about $2 billion in today's money, and Ocean City absorbed a grotesque share of it. The U.S. Corps of Engineers would later describe the storm as the most unexpected storm, most complex in structure, most unusual in behavior, and most devastating to the beaches, dunes, and barrier islands. But the Ash Wednesday storm did something beyond destruction. Across the inlet on Assateague Island, a group of Baltimore and Washington investors, led by a real estate promoter named Leon Ackerman, had been building a resort community called Ocean Beach. They had paved a 15-mile road down the island called Baltimore Boulevard. They had erected numbered street signs for streets that did not yet exist. They had sold 5,850 lots to more than 3,000 buyers at prices ranging from $1,250 to $8,500 each. Only about 30 buildings had actually been constructed. The storm erased nearly all of them, washed out the road, flattened the dunes, rendered the lots worthless. A 1955 federal survey had described the Maryland portion of Assateague as the site of one of the largest seashore developments on the Atlantic coast, and concluded that its advanced development appeared to preclude the possibility of this area being set aside for public recreational use. The storm made that conclusion obsolete in 3 days. By 1965, Congress had established the Assateague Island National Seashore. The wild horses that roam it today walk on sand that was supposed to hold vacation homes. On the Ocean City side, the calculus was different. The town had always been, without much discussion, a segregated resort. African Americans were not welcome at most hotels, and the beach itself was effectively restricted. A woman named Pearl Bonner purchased the Henry Hotel in 1964 and ran it as a rooming house for black visitors until her death in 2003, one of the few places in town where they could stay. The Civil Rights era arrived in Ocean City the way it arrived in many American resort towns. Slowly, reluctantly, and after the legal questions had already been settled elsewhere. The larger truth was that Ocean City's customer base was the white middle class of the Baltimore-Washington corridor, and the town's growth trajectory would be shaped almost entirely by that market's appetites and anxieties. Property values had collapsed. For investors with cash and nerve, the devastated island was a bargain. New building codes demanded stronger construction. The town enacted ordinances that would have been impossible before the storm. And in 1970, a developer named John Whaley built a 15-story condominium tower on 114th Street called High Point South. It was the first high-rise in Ocean City. Within 3 years, a mile-long stretch of beach in North Ocean City had been transformed into what locals called the Gold Coast, a wall of concrete towers facing the Atlantic. The Sheraton Fontainebleau went up on 101st Street as the first luxury high-rise motel. The Century rose to 28 stories, the tallest building in the resort. The Pyramid, English Towers, Atlantis, Capri, the Irene, the Fountainhead, Golden Sands, the 9,400. They went up fast, one after another, their shadows falling across the beach in the afternoon and giving the north end of the island an almost urban silhouette. More than 10,000 condominium units were built in that single decade. The Carousel Motel added a 21-story tower and an atrium with an ice skating rink. Ocean City was no longer a boardwalk town with Victorian porches. It was a vertical city of investors. The transformation was staggering. Walk the beach in 1968, and north of 40th Street, you would find sand dunes stretching to the horizon, seagrass bending in the wind, barely a structure in sight. Walk the same beach in 1975, and you were in the shadow of a concrete canyon. The towers cast the sand in shade by mid-afternoon. Residents who remembered the open beach watched the skyline rise with a mixture of pride and something closer to grief. Ocean City had become, almost overnight, a different kind of place. And then, in 1973, it all stopped. High interest rates, overbuilding, and the gas crisis combined to burst the bubble simultaneously. Banks failed. Developers went broke. The towers that had risen so fast stood nearly empty. Sales collapsed. There has never been another building frenzy like the Gold Coast boom, though the real estate market eventually recovered in the 1980s. By then, the units were being snapped up as vacation rentals and second homes, and the towers filled. But the character of the place had been permanently altered. The Petticoat Regime's boarding houses, where you dressed for dinner and danced under a crystal chandelier, were relics. The new Ocean City was about square footage and ocean views and return on investment. It was also increasingly about sand, or rather about the lack of it. Here is where the jetties come back into the story. When the government stabilized the 1933 inlet, the jetties did exactly what they were designed to do. They kept sand from drifting across the channel. But sand on a barrier island moves constantly, carried by currents and wind in a north to south direction called littoral drift. The jetties blocked that drift. Assateague, on the south side of the inlet, was starved of new sand and began receding westward. The northern 6 miles of the island have shifted hundreds of meters toward the mainland since the jetties were built. Meanwhile, Ocean City's natural dune system, the island's own defense against storm surge, was bulldozed to make room for buildings. Developers built right up to and beyond the primary dune line. The seasonal cycle of sand storage, where summer waves push sand onto the beach and winter storms pull it into offshore bars, was disrupted. The beach itself, the only reason anyone comes to Ocean City, began to shrink. The irony was structural and inescapable. The very infrastructure that made Ocean City a major resort, the stabilized inlet, the seawall along the boardwalk, the buildings crowding the dune line, was the same infrastructure stripping the beach of its ability to protect itself. A natural barrier island breathes. Sand moves onshore in summer, offshore in winter, rebuilds dunes over decades, migrates slowly westward as sea levels shift. Ocean City had pinned the island in place with concrete and steel, then wondered why the sand kept leaving. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, the width of the beach narrowed visibly. A 1985 EPA report warned that sea level rise could double the rate of erosion at Ocean City within 40 years. The town's own government described the situation in existential terms. A world-class recreational beach and its $1.5 billion in man-made structures were at risk. A major storm could drive waves across the diminished beach, undercut buildings, overrun the island, and cause catastrophic losses. The beach and the dune were Ocean City's levee system, and the levee was disappearing. In 1988, the Army Corps of Engineers began the first beach replenishment project, dredging sand from offshore shoals 7 miles out and pumping it onto the beach. In 1994, the state of Maryland, Worcester County, and the town of Ocean City entered into a 50-year partnership agreement with the Corps to perform periodic replenishment as needed. The federal government pays 53% of the cost. The state pays 23.5%. Worcester County and Ocean City each pay 11.75%. Every 4 years, roughly, a dredge ship sucks sand from the ocean floor and sprays it back onto the beach. The project has, by the Corps' own estimate, prevented more than $900 million in storm damage since it began. But the sand always washes away again. That is the nature of sand on a barrier island. You put it there, the ocean takes it. In 2021, the replenishment cost $15.7 million for 1.3 million cubic yards of sand, enough to fill 300 Olympic swimming pools. The 2026 project is estimated at $37 to $40 million, nearly double the previous cycle. The costs are rising not because the ocean is hungrier, though rising sea levels are accelerating erosion, but because the price of everything has gone up: fuel, labor, equipment, the dredging contracts themselves. Every 4 years, a city built on a strip of sand pays tens of millions of dollars to replace the sand it's built on. And every 4 years, the bill gets larger. Meanwhile, the population of year-round residents has barely changed in decades. The 2000 census counted 7,173 people. The 2010 census counted 7,102. The 2020 census counted 6,844. The median age of those residents is 55.6. Nearly 30% are 65 or older. Only 9% are under 18. It is a retirement community that moonlights for 14 weeks a year as one of the most crowded places on the East Coast. The summer economy runs on a labor force that largely does not live there and increasingly does not come from this country. Ocean City has roughly 12,000 seasonal positions to fill each year. About 4,000 of those are filled by college students from Eastern Europe, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere who come on J-1 exchange visitor visas through the State Department's summer work travel program. They work the hotel desks and the restaurant kitchens and the boardwalk amusement stands. In some years, churches across Ocean City have served free meals to J-1 students. The Ocean City Baptist Church alone once fed more than 1,700 participants from 46 countries in a single summer. One former J-1 student from Romania described arriving at 2 a.m. with 29 others and using a payphone to call a landlord they had wired $6,000 as a deposit. The system works in the sense that the hotels stay staffed and the fries get made. But it is fragile. In 2026, delays in visa processing threaten to leave hundreds of seasonal positions unfilled heading into Memorial Day weekend. The Chamber of Commerce president called the program a real asset and warned that slowing it down would slow down the economy. When a resort town's permanent population is 7,000 and its peak season workforce requires importing 4,000 people from overseas, the question of sustainability is not abstract. There is also the matter of what happens on the boardwalk after dark. In recent years, Ocean City has struggled with episodes of violence and disorder that would have been unimaginable to the families who once danced at the Pier Ballroom. Brawls caught on cell phone video, stabbings, an unsanctioned car rally called H2OI that brings thousands of enthusiasts and, some years, hundreds of arrests. In 2023, the town deployed Maryland State Police, Worcester County Sheriff's deputies, and officers from surrounding jurisdictions to maintain control during the rally. Bottles and bricks were thrown at officers. 277 arrests were made in 4 days. The mayor urged families to stay away during the event. In the summer of 2026, crowds over the 4th of July weekend produced more arrests, calls for service, and traffic enforcement than in any of the 4 previous years, though the major violence officials had feared never materialized. Social media-promoted takeover gatherings have become a recurring concern. The town has responded with increased policing, up to 150 officers in summer, augmented by state and county support, and with events designed to attract different crowds: Sunfest and Springfest, softball tournaments, fishing competitions, concert series. The White Marlin Open, which started in 1974 with 57 boats fishing for $20,000 in prizes, now draws roughly 400 boats competing for more than $10 million. In 2025, an angler named Dan Goff landed a 72-pound white marlin and took home $3.9 million. The tournament has paid out more than $113 million over its 50-year history. That is real economic activity, and it sustains Ocean City's claim as the white marlin capital of the world, a title it has held since the Marlin Club first started keeping records in the 1930s. But fishing tournaments bring thousands, not millions. The fundamental question for Ocean City remains what it has always been. Will people keep coming to the beach? And will there be a beach for them to come to? For years, Ocean City in winter was so empty that traffic lights were bagged up for the off-season, literally covered with black bags because there was no traffic to regulate. The convention center and a growing golf tourism market have changed that somewhat. Some restaurants that once closed from September to May now stay open year-round. But the fundamental asymmetry remains. A place built to hold hundreds of thousands that is inhabited for most of the year by a few thousand retirees and service workers. The numbers suggest the crowds are still arriving. 8 million visitors a year, the tourism department says. But the money has softened. A 2024 report showed that visitor numbers were not necessarily declining, but spending was. People were watching their pennies. Boardwalk restaurants that had expanded in optimistic years found sales lower than expected. Hotel occupancy held, but average daily rates plateaued. The visitors were still coming. They were just buying fewer slices of pizza. The drive itself has become its own deterrent. The sole route from the Baltimore-Washington corridor is US 50, 113 miles of 2-lane and 4-lane highway that becomes on summer weekends one of the most congested roads in the mid-Atlantic. 16-mile traffic backups have been documented, westbound on Sunday evenings as hundreds of thousands of people try to cross the Bay Bridge at the same time. State officials have eliminated the old toll booths, closed westbound access roads to weekend through traffic, done everything short of building a new bridge, and the situation is, by their own admission, only getting worse. The bridge that opened the eastern shore in 1952 is now a choke point that can add 2 or 3 hours to a trip that was supposed to take 3. Families sitting in traffic on Route 50, watching their children melt in the back seat, are doing the math that every beach town fears. Is this worth it? Delaware's beaches to the north, Rehoboth, Bethany, Dewey, are closer for many of the same families and offer a quieter, less congested alternative without the high-rise skyline. The competition is not theoretical. It is a GPS calculation updated in real time. The median home value in Ocean City today sits around $445,000, more than triple what it was in 2000. The mean price for a unit in a building with 5 or more units is over $465,000. Townhouses and attached units average close to $1 million. These are not homes for young families earning service industry wages. They are investments, second homes, retirement properties, and short-term rental units managed by property companies that handle everything from booking to linen service. The owner may live in Northern Virginia or suburban Philadelphia. The unit may be occupied 12 weeks a year. The rest of the time, it is inventory, a line item on a spreadsheet, generating revenue when rented and tax deductions when not. The old downtown, south of the condo towers, still has some of the character that once defined the whole town. Victorian houses with historic markers. St. Paul's by the Sea Episcopal Church, built in 1900 and listed on the National Register. The Lankford Hotel, dating to 1924. The Life-Saving Station Museum in the 1891 building where crews once launched into storm-tossed seas to rescue shipwreck victims. But many of the old wood-frame structures have been torn down in recent years to make way for parking lots, mid-rise condo buildings with rooftop pools, and mixed-use developments offering granite countertops and Italian stone floors. The extensive redevelopment is, the town's boosters say, putting a new face on Maryland's premier summertime destination. What it is actually doing is replacing the last physical evidence that Ocean City was ever anything other than an investment vehicle. The Plymouthman's cupola is still there. It has watched the Atlantic Hotel burn and be rebuilt. It has watched the 1933 hurricane rip the island in two. It has watched the 1962 storm bury cars in sand. It has watched the condominiums rise like a cliff face along the northern shore. It has watched the dredge ships pump imported sand onto a beach that did not need importing when Rosalie Tillman Shreve charged $2.50 for a room and a supper of broiled chicken, corn fritters, and peaches. $40 million to put the sand back every 4 years. That is the cost today of pretending a barrier island is permanent real estate. The federal government pays its share because the alternative, letting the ocean take back what it wants, would mean watching $1.5 billion in property wash into the Atlantic. The Army Corps has been protecting Ocean City since 1933, when it stabilized the inlet the hurricane created. 93 years of engineering against nature. The jetties that saved the inlet starved Assateague. The buildings that replaced the dunes removed the island's natural armor. The sand that gets pumped in every 4 years is the same sand the currents carry away, the same sand the jetties prevent from reaching the island next door. It is a closed loop of intervention, each fix creating the need for the next fix, the costs compounding with every cycle. And beneath all of it, the sea is rising. Tide gauge measurements on Maryland's coast show rates of sea level rise nearly twice the global average, 3 to 4 millimeters per year, or roughly a foot per century, with acceleration expected. A CBS analysis found that at least $1.2 billion in Worcester County property faces elevated risk of change over the next decade from coastal hazards. The town now requires developers to elevate new buildings. The City Council has drafted a policy to raise streets during periodic upgrades. These are the kinds of measures a place adopts when it has accepted that the ground beneath it is not stable, but has decided to stay anyway. In winter, when the last of the summer renters have gone and the boardwalk empties, and the traffic lights that were once bagged up for the off-season now stay lit for the handful of golfers and conventioneers, the wind comes off the ocean hard and cold and carries sand across the road in thin, skittering sheets. It fills the cracks in the boardwalk planks. It settles on the steps of the Plym Plaza. It gathers against the base of the seawall that separates the town from the beach, that separates the town from the sea. The sand is always moving. It has always been moving. It was moving when Isaac Coffin built his cottage in 1869, and when Rosalie Shreve opened the Plym Hymen in 1894, and when the hurricane punched a hole through the island in 1933, and when the Ash Wednesday storm buried Ocean City alive in 1962, and when John Whaley stacked 15 stories of concrete on 114th Street in 1970. The sand does not know about property values or beach replenishment schedules or 50-year partnership agreements with the Army Corps of Engineers. It does not know that 30,000 housing units and 8 million annual visitors depend on it staying in one place. It moves because that is what sand does on a barrier island at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. The dredge ships will come back after Labor Day. They always do.